Upper Midwest, 1883. While most settlers stored their harvest in burlap sacks stacked in barn corners, fast, cheap, and recommended in every local farming bulletin, one Norwegian immigrant was still building in late September. For massive grain bins, each 8 feet square and 7 feet tall. Raised on stone piers 2 feet off the ground. Lined inside with 3 inches of hand-packed clay. His neighbors called it old country foolishness. They said grain needed to breathe, that sealing it tight would ruin it faster than mice ever could. He spent 18 days and nearly double the cost of sacks on construction everyone dismissed as wasted effort. Then the great frost arrived. Temperatures dropped below -30 and stayed there for nearly 2 weeks straight. Wind chills reached -60. In standard storage sheds across the township, condensation formed, grain froze solid, sacks burst, and mold spread through what thawed. Families lost 30 to 50% of their winter stores within days. But those clay-lined bins? The grain poured freely at -20 degrees. No ice. No mold. Milling quality preserved. He fed 3 additional families for 6 weeks from stores that stayed intact. What did he understand about moisture, temperature, and sealing that conventional farming wisdom had forgotten, and why did the method neighbors mocked become township standard within 3 years? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time so we know where this documentary found you. The summer of 1883 brought a decent wheat harvest across the upper Midwest, and by late August most homesteaders were already storing their grain the way everyone did, in burlap sacks stacked in whatever shed or barn corner offered the driest spot. The method was fast, cheap, and endorsed by every agricultural newspaper that reached the territory. A man could thresh his grain, fill his sacks, and have the whole operation finished in 2 days. Cost ran about $6 to $8 for enough sacks to hold a season's harvest, sometimes less if you bought used. The sacks went straight onto plank floors or packed dirt, leaned against walls, and everyone agreed that was sufficient. Grain needed to breathe, the advice column said. Seal it too tight and you trap moisture, invite mold, ruin the whole store faster than any mouse could manage. But one Norwegian immigrant, a man who'd grown up in a cold agricultural district where winter grain preservation determined whether families lived or starved, was still building in late September while his neighbors watched and wondered what exactly he thought he was doing. He'd arrived in the territory 2 years prior with knowledge that didn't match the local consensus, and he'd spent those first seasons observing not just what his fellow settlers did, but what worked in the indigenous communities nearby. He'd seen raised caches that kept food dry through spring floods. He'd watched clay-sealed storage that rodents couldn't penetrate. And he remembered the timber-and-clay granaries from his childhood, structures built with the understanding that winter cold wasn't something you hoped would stay mild, it was something you prepared for with precision. So while others finished their storage work in days, he committed to something different. 4 bins, each 8 feet square and 7 feet tall. Not sacks that could be moved or shifted, but permanent structures built to last decades. He started with timber framing, cutting and pegging posts and beams without a single nail, the joints fitted so tight that the wood itself would hold under the weight of grain and the stress of temperature swings. Each bin rose on stone piers that lifted the structure 24 to 36 inches off the ground, high enough that capillary moisture from soil couldn't climb into the wood, high enough that ground frost couldn't reach the floor, high enough that mice and rats would find no easy path inside. The real work came with the clay lining. He dug clay from a deposit half a mile from his property, mixed it with chopped straw for binding strength, and packed it wet against the interior walls in layers 2 to 3 inches thick. Each layer had to dry before the next went on, and the drying took time, hours in dry sun, longer in humidity or shade. He worked methodically, smoothing the surface with his hands and a flat board, creating an interior shell that would harden into something closer to pottery than mud. The clay would do 2 things. Stop air from moving through gaps in the timber and create thermal mass that would absorb and release heat slowly, buffering the grain against the sudden temperature drops that turned other storage into frozen blocks. His neighbors watched this process with a mix of curiosity and derision. They saw a man spending 18 days on a project they could complete in an afternoon. They saw material costs climbing toward $11 to $14, nearly double what sacks would cost, with nothing to show for it but 4 heavy boxes that couldn't be moved if he changed his mind. They said he was building like it was the old country, like he hadn't figured out that American methods were faster and just as good. They said that grain would be mouse feed anyway, that you couldn't seal food tight without ruining it, that he was wasting time he'd regret when winter came and he was behind on everything else. But he kept building. He constructed lids from overlapping planks, designed so the seams wouldn't align and let moisture through. He planned to weight those lids with stones once the bins were filled, maintaining pressure that would keep the seal tight. He knew that the method required one critical step before sealing: the grain had to be dried to safe storage moisture, somewhere around 12 to 13%, low enough that it wouldn't spoil in the absence of airflow. That meant extra days of drying on tarps in the sun, turning the grain with rakes, checking it by feel and bite until he was certain it was ready. Then and only then would the grain go into the bins, the lids would go on, and the system would be sealed for winter. The conventional wisdom said this was all wrong. Ventilation was essential, everyone agreed. You needed air moving through your grain or condensation would form and rot would start. But the Norwegian homesteader had learned a different principle: if the grain was dry enough when you sealed it, and if the container maintained stable temperature, condensation wouldn't form because there was no moisture to condense and no temperature differential to trigger it. The clay lining would absorb minor humidity fluctuations. The elevation would prevent ground moisture from rising. The sealed lid would stop cold air from rushing in and creating the exact condensation problem everyone feared. By the time he finished in mid-October, the mockery had settled into a kind of bemused acceptance. His neighbors had moved on to other work, confident that his experiment would prove them right when spring came and he opened those bins to find spoiled grain and wasted effort. They had their sacks lined up in sheds and barns, ready for winter, stored the way their fathers had stored grain and the way agricultural experts recommended. Fast, efficient, proven by years of adequate results. The laughter had quieted, but the certainty remained. He'd built something excessive, something unnecessary, something that betrayed a failure to adapt to practical American farming. And when winter came, they'd all see who'd made the wiser choice. What made the clay-lined bins work wasn't mystery or luck, it was engineering that had been documented, tested, and proven in cold climates for generations before being dismissed as outdated by settlers who favored speed over resilience. The method succeeded because it addressed 3 specific problems that conventional storage ignored: moisture intrusion from below, temperature fluctuation from outside, and air exchange that created condensation. Each element of the construction solved a measurable challenge, and together they created an environment where grain could remain stable through temperature swings that would destroy sack storage within days. The elevation came first, and it mattered more than most farmers realized. By raising the bins 24 to 36 inches off the ground on stone piers, the Norwegian homesteader eliminated capillary action, the process by which moisture moves upward through porous materials like wood and dirt. Sacks placed directly on barn floors, even plank floors, absorbed ground moisture constantly. In winter, that moisture froze, creating ice crystals within the grain itself. The elevated bins stopped this process entirely. No contact with soil meant no pathway for moisture to climb. The stone piers conducted almost no heat, which meant ground frost couldn't reach the wooden floor of the bins even when temperatures dropped well below zero. Rodents, which could chew through burlap in minutes, found no easy access to grain suspended 3 feet in the air with no cover nearby to hide their approach. The clay lining provided the second layer of protection, and it functioned in ways that went beyond simple waterproofing. The homesteader had dug clay from a local deposit, mixed it with chopped straw in roughly a 10-to-1 ratio, and packed it wet against the interior timber frame in layers. Each layer went on 2 to 3 inches thick and dried for a full day before the next application. The straw provided tensile strength, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried and shrank. Once cured, the clay created an airtight vapor barrier that sealed gaps between timber boards and prevented air movement through the walls. But the clay did something more important: it provided thermal mass. Clay absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, which meant the interior temperature of the bins fluctuated far less than the outside air. Where external temperatures might swing 40 degrees or more between day and night, the clay-lined bins maintained stability within 5 degrees. This mattered because condensation forms when warm, moist air contacts a cold surface. By preventing rapid temperature change, the clay eliminated the conditions that caused condensation in the first place. The grain itself required preparation that most settlers skipped. Before sealing the bins, the homesteader dried his wheat to a moisture content of 12 to 13%, testing it by biting kernels and feeling for the hard, glassy texture that indicated safe storage level. This took extra days of work, spreading grain on tarps in the sun, raking it to expose all surfaces, bringing it inside if rain threatened, then spreading it again. Most farmers dried their grain just enough to thresh cleanly, then moved directly to sack storage, assuming that ventilation would handle any remaining moisture. But ventilation in winter meant cold air rushing in, and cold air contacting warmer grain created the exact condensation that ruined storage. The Norwegian method inverted this logic: dry the grain thoroughly first, then seal it in a stable environment where no new moisture could enter and no temperature shock could trigger condensation. The lid system completed the design. Each bin had a plank cover constructed from overlapping boards, the seams offset so no straight line of exposure ran from outside to inside. Once the bin was filled, carefully, so the grain settled evenly without voids that might shift and create pressure points, the lid went on and stones weighing 30 to 50 pounds each pressed it into place. The weight maintained constant pressure on the seal, and the overlapping boards prevented wind from lifting the edges or rain from penetrating gaps. In spring and summer, the homesteader would open the bins periodically to check the grain and allow any minimal moisture accumulation to evaporate. But once winter cold arrived, the bins stayed sealed. No ventilation. No air exchange. No pathway for cold to enter and warm interior air to escape. The entire system relied on a principle that frontier agricultural advice had either forgotten or never learned: stable environment beats air circulation when grain is properly dried beforehand. Indigenous plains communities had known this for generations, using sealed pits and clay-lined caches to preserve food through winters far harsher than anything most settlers had experienced in their home countries. Scandinavian granaries operated on the same principle: thick walls, minimal ventilation, reliance on initial drying rather than ongoing air exchange. The knowledge existed in multiple traditions, proven by survival across centuries, but American agricultural bulletins of the 1870s and 80s favored methods that worked adequately in mild winters and failed catastrophically when real cold arrived. The numbers told the story with precision. Inside the sealed bins, temperature variation stayed below 5 degrees Fahrenheit on a daily basis. Outside, temperatures swung from afternoon highs in the teens to nighttime lows below zero, a range exceeding 40 degrees. Grain moisture remained constant at 12 to 13% because no new moisture entered and the stable temperature prevented condensation. Rodent loss dropped to near zero, contrast with the 5 to 15% loss typical in sack storage where mice chewed through burlap and nested in the grain itself. The clay lining, which cost the homesteader nothing but labor since he dug it from his own land, provided insulation value equivalent to several inches of wood. The elevation added less than $3 to material costs, just the stone for piers, but eliminated an entire category of moisture problems that no amount of sack rotation could solve. This wasn't experimental technology or untested theory. It was documented practice that worked because it addressed the actual mechanisms of grain spoilage rather than relying on assumptions about what grain needed. The method was known. It was ignored. And when winter cold arrived with a severity that exposed the failure of conventional wisdom, the difference between the two approaches would be measured not in percentage points of loss, but in families fed or starving. The cold came in January of 1884, and it came with a completeness that made previous winters seem like mild rehearsals. An Arctic outbreak pushed south across the plains with sustained temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. Wind chills, estimated by later meteorological analysis, reached below -60. The cold didn't arrive as a single storm that passed in days, it settled over the upper Midwest and held for 10 to 14 consecutive days, a duration that turned adequate preparation into bare survival and exposed every weakness in how settlers had built, stored, and planned. The first losses came quickly. In sheds and barns across the township, condensation formed on the inside surfaces within hours of the temperature drop. Warm air from the previous day's relatively mild weather, anything above zero felt mild now, met surfaces chilled to -30, and moisture condensed instantly. That moisture froze into ice crystals that spread across burlap sacks, penetrated the weave, and reached the grain itself. Within 2 days, grain that had been dry enough to mill was freezing into solid masses. Sacks that settlers had stacked carefully against walls now held blocks of wheat and corn frozen so hard they couldn't be broken apart without tools. The cold was relentless in ways that defied the usual winter rhythms. Daytime offered no relief. Temperatures that might normally climb to 10 or 15 above zero at midday stayed locked below -20. Nights dropped even further. Homesteaders burned through firewood at double and triple the normal rate just to keep living spaces above freezing. Barns went unheated, no one could spare the fuel, which meant any grain stored there experienced the full force of the Arctic air. The wind made everything worse. Even slight breezes at -30 created wind chills that froze exposed skin in minutes and found every gap in wall construction, every crack around doors, every imperfect seal in storage sheds. By the end of the first week, settlers began assessing their losses and the arithmetic was devastating. Grain that froze solid couldn't be threshed or milled until it thawed, and when it thawed the condensation that had formed ice crystals turned into liquid water that soaked through the kernels. Wet grain in winter meant mold within days. Some farmers tried to salvage their stores by bringing sacks into heated living spaces to thaw slowly, but the moisture damage was already done. Others discovered that the burlap itself had weakened from repeated freeze-thaw cycles, splitting open and spilling grain onto barn floors where it mixed with dirt and debris. Average losses across the township ranged from 30 to 50% of stored grain, and those were the farms where men had tried to intervene. Farms where storage went unchecked for the first week lost more. The crisis extended beyond simple grain loss. Livestock depended on that grain for winter feed, and as stores spoiled or froze into unusable masses, farmers faced immediate decisions about which animals could be sustained and which couldn't. Emergency slaughter began within days. Families who'd planned to bring cattle and hogs through to spring suddenly had to butcher in the worst possible conditions, -20-degree temperatures that froze meat before it could be properly processed, and no way to preserve it all before spoilage began. The local mill, which ground grain for the entire region, shut down within a week. The miller couldn't process frozen grain, and the few farmers who still had usable stores weren't willing to transport it through cold that could kill a man caught outside without proper shelter. The cold created a cascade of failures that interconnected in ways no single family could solve alone. Grain loss meant livestock slaughter meant excess meat that couldn't all be consumed or preserved meant protein waste at exactly the moment when caloric intake mattered most. Firewood consumption doubled meant men spent hours outside in dangerous cold cutting and hauling wood that should have lasted weeks longer. Mill closure meant even families with intact grain couldn't get it ground into flour without hand-grinding small batches in kitchen mills designed for supplemental use, not primary food production. Everything took longer, required more effort, and burned through reserves that had seemed adequate before the cold arrived. The temperature stayed brutal through the second week. Morning readings of -35. Afternoon highs that barely reached -20. Wind that never stopped, driving the chill through clothing and walls and turning short trips to barns or storage sheds into dangerous expeditions. Water froze solid in wells. Livestock suffered despite every effort to shelter them. And the grain that was supposed to sustain families and animals until spring planting, remained frozen or spoiled or destroyed in storage methods that worked fine in average winters but failed catastrophically when real cold tested them. Some families began rationing immediately, cutting back on bread and porridge to stretch whatever grain remained usable. Others looked toward neighbors for loans or barter, hoping someone had surplus to share. The social networks that defined frontier life, the assumptions about mutual aid and community support, started to show strain as everyone realized simultaneously that this wasn't a problem one family faced while others had plenty. This was universal shortage created by universal failure of the same storage methods everyone had used. The question became not whether you'd ask neighbors for help, but whether neighbors had anything left to share after their own losses. And in that calculation, the difference between adequate storage and engineered storage would determine who survived winter comfortably and who barely survived at all. The cold held through mid-January, then finally broke. Temperatures climbed back to 0, then 10 above, then 20, conditions that 2 weeks earlier would have seemed harsh but now felt almost warm. The thaw revealed the full extent of the damage. Burst sacks. Molded grain. Empty feed bins. And across the township, families running calculations about whether what remained would last until spring or whether harder choices still lay ahead. When the Norwegian homesteader opened his first bin in late January, 3 weeks after the cold had finally broken, he did it without announcement or ceremony. He simply removed the weighted stones from the lid, lifted the overlapping planks, and looked inside at grain that had spent 2 weeks sealed in darkness while temperatures outside dropped to -35 degrees. The wheat poured freely when he scooped it with a wooden measure. No ice crystals clung to the kernels. No frozen mass required chipping or thawing. The grain felt cool to the touch but moved like it was mid-autumn, each kernel separate and dry. He brought a handful to his face and smelled nothing but wheat, no trace of mold, no sour fermentation, no moisture that would indicate the condensation problems destroying his neighbor's stores. He filled a sack with 20 pounds and walked it to the local mill, which had reopened cautiously after the temperature climbed back above 0. The miller was a practical man whose business depended on grain quality, not theory or opinion. He'd spent the previous weeks turning away farmers whose grain arrived frozen solid or so moisture damaged that his millstones would clog within minutes. When the Norwegian homesteader poured his sample onto the inspection table, the miller ran it through his fingers, bit a kernel to test hardness, and then did what he'd been unable to do for most of January, he ground it. The wheat milled cleanly. No excess moisture gummed the stones. No off-smell indicated spoilage. The flour came out fine and dry, exactly as it should. The miller looked up and asked a simple question: how much more did he have? The answer was most of it. The homesteader had filled his 4 bins in October with approximately 2,000 pounds of wheat, enough to feed his family through winter and spring with surplus for seed and potential sale. After the Great Frost, he still had roughly 70% of that original store in milling quality condition. He'd used some for his own consumption through the winter, but the sealed bins had protected the rest so completely that what remained was indistinguishable from grain stored in perfect autumn conditions. No freezing. No thawing. No mold. No rodent damage. The clay lining and elevated construction had maintained interior conditions stable enough that the grain never experienced the temperature shock that destroyed conventional storage. Word spread quietly at first. The miller mentioned to another farmer that someone had brought in good grain. That farmer asked who, then asked where the grain had come from. Within days, neighbors who'd mocked the clay-lined bins as wasteful old country thinking were walking past the homesteader's property and noticing that his bin still stood sealed and intact while their own sheds held ruins of burst sacks and spoiled stores. No one arrived with apologies or admissions of error. They came instead with practical questions about whether he might have grain to spare, phrased carefully as requests for loans rather than charity, as though the distinction mattered when everyone understood the real situation. The homesteader responded without gloating or speeches. He opened his bins and measured out rations, 50 pounds here, 75 pounds there, to families whose own stores had been destroyed. He kept records of every quantity distributed, writing down names and amounts in a ledger that documented exactly what went where. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense, though he never pressed for immediate repayment. It was measured assistance from someone who prepared correctly to those who hadn't, delivered without judgment but also without pretending the difference didn't exist. He provided roughly 1,200 pounds of grain over 6 weeks, feeding 3 additional families through the remainder of winter when their own storage had failed completely. The families who received that grain survived because of it. The arithmetic was straightforward. An average family of 5 needed approximately 8 to 10 pounds of grain per day for bread, porridge, and livestock feed. 50 pounds covered 5 days. 75 pounds covered a week. The homesteader's distributions, spread across multiple families and multiple weeks, filled gaps that would otherwise have forced much harder decisions about slaughter, rationing, or leaving the territory entirely. No one died of starvation in the township that winter, but the margin between adequate nutrition and desperation came down to whether you had access to grain that remained usable after 2 weeks of Arctic cold. The homesteader's own family fared better than survival. They maintained normal consumption through the entire winter because their grain supply never wavered. They didn't ration bread or reduce porridge portions or worry about whether stores would last until spring. And because they maintained steady caloric intake, they burned less firewood. The body generates less heat demand when properly fed. The homesteader calculated later that his family used roughly 40% less firewood than the previous winter, not because the winter was milder but because consistent nutrition reduced the body's need to generate warmth through shivering and metabolism. The sealed bins, which neighbors had called excessive, delivered surplus protection that extended beyond grain preservation into fuel efficiency and overall winter comfort. By March, when the worst of winter had clearly passed and spring planting preparations began, the social dynamic in the township had shifted without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. The farmers who'd lost 30 to 50% of their grain were buying seed from those who had surplus. The homesteader sold some of his remaining store at fair prices, recouping his initial construction costs and then some. Others asked detailed questions about how the bins were built, what timber dimensions he'd used, how thick the clay lining was, whether the stone piers required special placement, how he determined when grain was dry enough to seal. He answered every question directly, offering measurements and techniques without reservation, explaining that the method wasn't secret or proprietary but simply older knowledge that worked better than newer advice. Some families began gathering materials that spring for their own clay-lined bins, planning to have them ready before the next harvest. Others remained skeptical, arguing that the Great Frost was an anomaly and that normal winters wouldn't require such elaborate preparation. But the evidence was concrete and the comparison was stark. One method had preserved grain through the worst cold in living memory while the other had failed across the entire township. The difference between foolishness and wisdom, it turned out, was just one winter. And that winter had taught its lesson with the clarity that only survival arithmetic provides. By autumn of 1884, 6 farms in the township had built clay-lined storage bins based directly on the Norwegian homesteader's design. The construction followed his specifications with minor variations. Some builders used 10-foot squares instead of 8, others elevated their bins a full 4 feet instead of 3, but the core principles remained identical. Stone pier foundations to eliminate ground moisture. Timber framing with peg joints. Interior clay lining 2 to 3 inches thick mixed with straw for tensile strength. Elevated sills. Weighted plank lids with overlapping seams. Grain dried to 12 to 13% moisture before sealing. The method spread through direct observation and practical conversation rather than through any formal instruction or published guide. Farmers who'd lost grain the previous winter simply asked how to prevent it from happening again, and the homesteader told them exactly what he'd done and why each element mattered. The local agricultural bulletin, published monthly out of the nearest town with railroad access, ran a revised storage recommendation that fall. The article didn't mention the Great Frost specifically or acknowledge that previous advice had failed, but it quietly endorsed sealed storage with clay or plaster lining for regions experiencing sustained cold below zero. The language was careful, presenting the method as suitable for extreme conditions rather than admitting it should have been standard practice all along. The bulletin included basic measurements and construction steps that matched what the Norwegian homesteader had been teaching his neighbors for months. Within 3 years, clay-lined bins appeared across the entire township and began showing up in adjacent communities as word spread through family connections and market day conversations. The adoption happened without drama or public vindication. No one gathered to formally declare that the old country method had been right and modern sack storage had been wrong. The change occurred through the quiet arithmetic of survival. Farmers who built sealed bins kept their grain through the next several winters, and farmers who didn't faced ongoing losses whenever temperatures dropped severely. The method proved itself through repetition, through winters that weren't as brutal as 1884 but still cold enough to freeze sack-stored grain and destroy conventional storage. Each winter provided another data point, another comparison between sealed bins that worked and open storage that failed, until the question wasn't whether to build clay-lined bins but simply when you'd find time to construct them before the next harvest. The historical validation came later and from sources that had no connection to the Norwegian homesteader or his township. United States Department of Agriculture bulletins published in the 1890s and early 1900s quietly endorsed sealed storage for grain in cold climates, recommending methods that included elevation, vapor barriers, and minimal ventilation once grain reached safe moisture levels. The bulletins didn't cite frontier experimentation or indigenous knowledge or Scandinavian granary practice, but the techniques they described were identical to what communities across the upper Midwest had already adopted through hard experience. The official endorsement simply confirmed what farmers had learned through loss and observation, that older methods of preservation, developed in climates where winter cold was guaranteed rather than occasional, provided protection that newer efficiency-focused approaches couldn't match. The knowledge itself traced back through multiple traditions that had solved the same problems independently. Scandinavian granaries had used thick walls and minimal ventilation for centuries, relying on initial grain drying in stable interior environments rather than air circulation. Indigenous plains communities had preserved food through winters far harsher than most settlers experienced, using sealed pits, elevated caches, and clay lining to protect against moisture, temperature swings, and rodents. Both traditions understood principles that American agricultural advice of the 1870s and 80s had either forgotten or dismissed, that proper preservation requires matching storage method to climate reality, that sealing works better than ventilation when moisture is controlled beforehand, and that thermal mass stabilizes temperature better than thin walls with air exchange. What settlers called primitive or outdated was actually engineering refined through generations of testing under conditions where failure meant starvation. The Norwegian homesteader never wrote a manual or gave formal lectures about his storage method. He simply answered questions when neighbors asked, showed them his bins when they wanted to see the construction details, and continued using the same techniques year after year because they worked. By the time he was an old man, clay-lined bins had become standard across the region, so common that younger farmers didn't know there'd ever been controversy about whether to build them. The method had transitioned from mocked innovation to regional practice to assumed knowledge within a single generation, which is how most practical wisdom spreads when survival provides the testing ground and arithmetic provides the proof. The lesson the Great Frost taught extended beyond grain storage into a broader principle about preparation and knowledge. On the frontier, the difference between adequate and excessive often wasn't clear until conditions turned severe enough to test every assumption. Methods that worked in average years failed in extreme years, and extreme years arrived without warning or mercy. The choice wasn't between old ways and new ways but between methods that addressed actual mechanisms of failure and methods that relied on hope that conditions would stay moderate. The Norwegian homesteader had built his bins assuming winter would be harsh because that's what his childhood experience had taught him to expect. His neighbors had built for average conditions because that's what recent winters and local advice suggested was sufficient. When the test came, preparation didn't announce itself or gloat. It simply worked, patient as clay, while inadequate storage failed around it. The story ended the way most frontier stories end, with knowledge proven, adopted, and eventually absorbed into common practice until its origins were forgotten. The clay-lined bins remained standing for decades, serving families and farms through winters mild and severe, no longer remarkable but simply present. What had been called foolish became standard. What had been mocked became method. And the principle underneath it all, that older knowledge often contains survival wisdom that newer efficiency discards at its own risk, remained true whether anyone remembered to say it aloud or not. On the frontier, preparation does not announce itself. It waits, patient as clay, until the cold arrives.